Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to return to Suffolk. I'm afraid I don't have any whizzy, flashy overheads. I'm afraid you've got to listen to me. And thank you for the introduction, Anthony. I was fascinated by the work in Suffolk, albeit some years ago. I could be fascinated because by background, I'm a researcher. I'm interested in professional curiosity, but I like to think of it as nosiness. I've always been struck by the readiness with which people will talk about their lives, whether we're on buses, whether we're waiting in a queue for a coffee, or whether we're in a dining room. And I think what I find most interesting about mental capacity is that we are all its subjects, we are all its potential subjects. And my passion for it does connect to the work that I've been doing over many years. So if I think back to the matter of constipation, I recall most particularly the anguish of the parents and relatives of the two people who died. There were two reviews published about the same time by myself and by Ruth Ely. And the parents, their authority, their expertise, the fact that they loved their relatives to bits, was set aside and professional judgment prevailed. It was assumed of one person that he was able to attend to himself in the toilet. He was able to attend to himself. And when he was asked, have you been? And we use very oblique language, don't we, when we're talking about constipation. Have you been? He would say yes. There's a huge amount of research that suggests that it's not the best way of asking questions of people with limited cognitive functioning because they're likely to be acquiescent. So, is it raining outside? Yes. Is it sunny outside? Yes. We should be asking more open-ended questions, and we should also be giving people the best way we can, the best means we have of enabling them to talk to us. Staying with the topic, I got in touch with Sheila Hollins at St George's Hospital in London, and she produces books beyond words, which are books solely of pictures. And these books are designed with people with learning disabilities, people with an interest in the lives and circumstances of people with learning disabilities. And the result was this book, The Trouble with Poo. And I have to say, in preparing the story, how do you start with a story about constipation? Well, yes, it does in fact indeed require us to share something of our own experiences. And I think the group that participated kept saying, it's hilarious, isn't it? It's hilarious. And just before lockdown, I was involved in a reading group for people with learning disabilities. I live in Wales, and we wanted people with learning disabilities to use the libraries. And so we had these books of pictures for people to tell their stories. It was a way that they could communicate something about their experience. And those were phenomenally enjoyable events. And I learned a great deal about these people. I learned about the assumptions that we make about people, the biases that we have, and the fact that one man who, when he saw images, and how do you illustrate someone who is struggling on the toilet? See, even my language is becoming a little bit neater, isn't it? How do you illustrate this? One man who had been mostly silent stood up and said, "There she blows. It's the only way to do it." And that was incredibly helpful because people did talk about some of the struggles they had and the diets that they had. And so it goes on. So this is many years later. This is just one example. And there are and should be others. It's very tempting to think, well, we've sorted this problem. We've sorted it. We haven't actually sorted it. We have dealt with it. We've had the review, but what next? And that's a very sound question for families to ask. What next? So you've done the review. What's going to happen now? What's in place now to make sure that other people aren't going to struggle? think when I started thinking about what I was going to say to you, and I know that you're very interested in executive capacity, but if I stay with this topic of constipation just for a couple of more minutes, if only somebody had said, someone who was supporting one of these two people, someone had said, show and tell, let's do show and tell. You say you can manage yourself in the toilet. Show me how you manage that. And really that's what executive capacity is. It's not just about making a note that, X number of people said this. It's back to the almost school time observation, show and tell. I think layered onto this, though, is the fact that this is not an easy subject. There aren't many of us who willingly assist people in the toilet. There is, in fact, work around the subject of physical disgust. But we have to acknowledge that, and we have to make sure that people understand that if this is a priority for a family, and indeed it was a priority for these families, that critical information is moved into the future. Very often, whether it was at Winterbourne View Hospital or at Corston Park Hospital, I met families in despair that their experiential knowledge, their intimate knowledge of their daughters and sons was set aside in favour of staff taking the view that they knew what to do. Some staff were very upfront, let's start with a blank sheet of paper. They're adults now, they're over 18, as though that means that somehow families have no roles whatsoever. It's a topic that's quite personal to me as well. I have a brother with a learning disability, and I've become quite accustomed, or I did become accustomed, to being set aside and being told, well, he's only, he's over 18, he's an adult now. And some pretty reckless decisions were made about his life from which his siblings were excluded. And I say siblings because as you get older, you move into the spaces that are left by your parents, and my sisters and I are as one on the subject of our brother. We look out for him. He's a good man, and he looks out for us. But decisions that have been made about him have sometimes been reckless, including that he moves from his accommodation without informing us. That was a long time ago, by the way. I did write about it, and I did receive apologies, which mattered. But the fact was, it was hugely disruptive and terribly distressing for his family. So one of the things that I think I'd like to draw your attention to, and I'm not going to labour the Mental Capacity Act, because I'm going to labour the fact that it is part of our everyday lives. I'm going to ask you, has anyone here got a lasting power of attorney? One, two, there are three of us, four of us. Four of us. Oh, heck. Now, when I come again, I want to ask that question, and I'd like there to be more hands up. Why? Because the Mental Capacity Act is about looking forward. It's about assessing now for the future. And we have to think really very hard about what comes next. It enables us to make decisions that we want for ourselves and also for our loved ones. And we have to do it before we become incapacitated. So I would urge you to think about its merits for yourself, for your partners, and for relatives who may well become incapacitated. It's really very important. I should ask about wills, but I won't, because solicitors, I would hope, would also ask people about mental capacity and lasting powers of attorney. But I suppose the crude point is, if we're not really engaged with this in our own lives, how are we promoting it to the people that we work with and the people that we support? Perhaps if there had been a lasting power of attorney for the two people in relation to whose deaths were associated with constipation, a different outcome would have been realised, because it wouldn't have been possible to exclude the family altogether. Now, in the Mental Capacity Act, there is in section 4 a question, or rather an observation. And that's about consultation duties. And this is highly pertinent when people are placed in settings and the families are perhaps some distance away or are not able to visit as frequently as they would wish. But in promoting these duties under the Mental Capacity Act in different settings and contexts, we have to take account rather, the views of, and this is the quotation, anyone named by the person as someone to be consulted on the matter in question. Now that's somewhat convoluted, but if I asked you, who would you want to help you if there was a difficult decision to be made? Who would you say? And I guarantee that many of the people that I've met in different conditions of detention would say their mum, their dad, or even their sibling, or their uncle and aunt. That question has to be asked, and yet there are no consequences for not asking it. We're more likely to get asked, who's the next of kin, which has no legal meaning whatsoever. Next of kin doesn't mean anything. But actually, section 4, anyone named by the person as someone to be consulted on the matter in question. Now, because I'm interested in history, I'm going to give you a flavour of what it was that families told an anthropologist some years ago. Jane Hubert was an anthropologist at St George's Hospital, and I worked alongside her. And she did some work in long-stay hospitals and sat and watched. So she was interested in social care and healthcare, but she sat and watched. And she also spoke to some of the parents of the men who were in the ward in which she spent a great deal of time. And she spoke of one mother whose son's appearance provoked hostile stares and sometimes laughter in the street. And his mum said, and I quote, "It's upsetting. I get really hurt because of him. And I think, well, he doesn't look like a monster from outer space. I mean, he's beautiful. He's hard work, but he's worth it. I wouldn't part with him. I'll look after him till every breath in my body goes." Compare that with the institutional assessment of him. Physical health, good. Psychiatric diagnosis, autism. PIMRA scores low. Medication, about 12 drugs cited. Adaptive behaviour scale, 10th decile. Brief ability disability assessment scale, fully ambulant, unable to read, write or count, very few spoken words, said to enjoy television. Aberrant behaviour checklist, high in irritability. Physically aggressive, seeks attention, injures self, screams when agitated, e.g., he tends to repeat the word blind, and if staff don't repeat it after him, he will start screaming. Jane wrote, "That may be because Rob is blind, and this is seldom acknowledged, and no concessions are made to his needs in the institutional environment. Only one member of staff did acknowledge it, and when he said to her in his desperate way, 'Blind, blind, blind,' she would hold his hand and say, 'I know,' and he would be quiet." Assumptions about people are prevalent. Unconscious biases, laughter in the street, people's appearance that excites under expectation. I remember many years ago when I looked at some of the circumstances surrounding Stephen Hoskin's murder in Cornwall. And it was said of him he looked as though he had a learning disability. And yet looking at the photographs of Stephen, he was actually quite a handsome man. I couldn't understand why he looked. I mean, he didn't have the stigmata of any particular syndromes, for example. But when I saw other photographs, I could see that the way he dressed, the sort of more dynamic features of our appearance, he did look different. He looked very different, and certainly nothing like his peers. And that prompted one professional to say he looks as though he's got a learning disability. There were 20 men that lived on this ward, and at the beginning of Jane's research project, Before the fieldwork had begun, the female psychiatrist in charge described all the men in the ward as either perpetrators or victims of sexual abuse, or both. And she added that the ward, quote, smelled of sex, unquote. But subsequent experience in the ward didn't bear out any of this. It smelled of feces, of urine, and drug-laden breath, but not sex. And what she was really suggesting was something very different. That these men were sexually uncontrolled, polluting, and that's a common fantasy. In fact, Deborah Deno described hypersexual eugenic burdens as the term that was used to categorize men and women with learning disabilities who were seen as potentially going to damage the great gene pool. There are clear undercurrents of fear and prurience in the way in which they were spoken. And it's something that I've learned over the years, that reliance solely on professional views and reliance solely on what is written in a document is nothing compared to what it is that we can learn from other people. And there is no underestimating the significance and importance of engaging with somebody who loves a client, who loves a patient. We learn so much more that way. Another reason that I became very interested in mental capacity and executive functioning was some work that I did with lawyers at Liverpool University some years ago. And I learned, and we were interested in healthcare decision making, which is highly pertinent, of course, to the mental capacity legislation. And typically, we invoke the Court of Protection to assist with the really thorny matters. But we were interested in choices, because choices were seen as the reason for the explanation for particular behaviours. So, for example, one woman said, "My sister has severe learning disabilities. She barely manages with inconsistent support. She struggles with personal hygiene and with keeping her flat clean, particularly her kitchen. I don't know how she hasn't had food poisoning. But I'm seen as overprotective when I challenge her want of help, especially when I'm told it's her choice to have her kitchen just as she wants it. They've even said it's her choice to get pregnant if she wants, but concede that if she chooses not to cooperate with all that having a baby implies, the baby will be taken from her. What does that say about choice? I guarantee if she were 80 and in a home, her so-called choices wouldn't be so revered." And another support worker observed, "She knows what she's doing. She leaves the hostel and goes off to the red light district. It's her choice to sell herself to men. She's had some sex education, so she knows how dangerous it is. She smells because she won't wash herself, and she seems to have leg ulcers, but says she doesn't want to go to the doctors. Other women make these kinds of choices. That's what an ordinary life is about." So, it was these kinds of scenarios that led us to reflect on how services can and do damage health if we don't ask questions about what it is we are not doing. Not least in terms of the readiness to accept that having a baby without the promise of support, staying in bed, being inattentive to hygiene routines, and declining to see a doctor are matters of non-negotiable choice. Yet those are played out in service settings. Anthony made reference to Winterbourne View, where people were allowed to stay in bed all day. Similarly, at Causton Park Hospital, people were allowed to stay in bed all day, patients, as they were called. These are young men and women. Not many of us stay in bed all day. And of course there are Saturdays, of course there's weekends, but usually after a busy week. But people's weeks were not busy, and people talked about being extremely and extraordinarily bored. And it was an injustice that young people had nothing to do, so why wouldn't they stay in bed each day? Now, we are competent. We have the means to say no to particular kinds of treatment. We can do that. And and even if others disagree with us, our view can prevail. We can even say no at the end of our lives, but it's unlikely that we'll say no to everything. We're unlikely, for example, to say no to pain control. And yet it seemed to us, from the work that we were doing with adults with learning disabilities, that saying no meant that's it. She said no, that was their choice. And so we asked a number of questions. Is the process of determining that people are making choices, is it specifically and explicitly discussed? And it rarely is. And there's a read over there to mental capacity. There are adults who I've been told are making capacitous decisions, and the evidence isn't there. We've heard about the importance of evidence, but it's just not there. Well, the notes have been archived. No, they're too recent. The evidence isn't there. And it's not about covering our backs or other bits of ourselves. It is truly about keeping track of what it is that we are doing and have done. And frequently, the discourse of rights is used. We've heard about normalisation this morning. That's also implicated in the guise of people's choices. And the fatal implications of choices were very rarely considered. So it was that blanket cherishing of choices that made me think, for goodness sake, we can do better than this. And the Law Commission in the 90s drew together the experience of practitioners, researchers, and said, how do we do this and how can we do it better? And we've got the Mental Capacity Act. Now, Anthony's mentioned the forum. It's on, I'm very recently become chair of the forum. Can I ask, has anyone ever heard of the forum? Don't be embarrassed. One hand. It's okay. I hadn't heard of it even, I think, 3 years ago. So the forum was established by the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Health and Social Care in 2015, when the House of Lords post-scrutiny legislation of the Mental Capacity Act said we actually need a means of increasing awareness and making connections between the professionals who need to know about this legislation. So that's how come the forum was established. My predecessor was Baroness Laura Finlay, and at the end of, I think it was really in 2021, because of the pandemic, she created a series of webinars. And they were incredibly well attended because, as we heard earlier, the guidance about visiting, about staff, was not easy to follow. And for those in services, it was a very tough time. And I think I was particularly inspired by the fact that Baroness Finlay brought in lawyers who could speak the language that practitioners want, to say, this is our best interpretation, this is what we believe this is about, this is what we think you should be doing. And that was complemented by the views and perspectives of relatives and families. These are the things that they said were important. And it was a piece of feedback from one woman who was running a small unit, people with mental health challenges, who said those webinars were really helpful during the pandemic. I could not make sense of the guidance, and the webinars helped. So I think I would want to be part of anything that helps any of us, all of us, to make better decisions and to support people to the best of our ability. So you have an opportunity here, if not this morning, but later, to shape what it is that the forum can do. Now, when I spoke to colleagues about, what sort of things you want me to say about the forum, they said, well, just tell us what you intend to do. So I thought that it would make sense to have at least minimally a website or a blog that is freestanding, because actually if you look up Mental Capacity Forum at the moment, you'll find yourself on a bit of the Ministry of Justice website, or indeed on the Department of Health and Social Care, or even on the Sky website, and then you have to work your way through a load of training programs. So I thought something maybe freestanding that doesn't overwhelm people with content, because the case law, some of it is complicated, and we expect that. It's troubling as well. The case of JD, can men with cognitive challenges, may they have sex? Should the Mental Capacity Act be even straying in the bedroom? These are some of the challenges that lawyers and practitioners are debating today. It's not going to be a website that gives people the answers, but it's going to enable people to think hard about the consequences of particular decision-making in certain scenarios across settings. So it seems to me to have a website that's got a perspective of family, a perspective of the person themselves, those of the professionals, will be really helpful. Incredible and much greater visibility and engagement with people with learning disabilities, autism, acquired brain injuries, mental health challenges, and dementia as potential subjects, not excluding ourselves as potential subjects. So what it is that we are learning from these different groups, and necessarily looking at greater visibility, incredible engagement with ethnic groups and people of colour. They are fairly invisible in this work. I think undue influence is a very particular theme, and something that I know exercises a lot of practitioners is the issue of predatory marriage or predatory relationships. Certainly when I chaired the Safeguarding Board in Lancashire, there were several people who had been duped into having relationships that they believed were authentic. And they went online, and not many of us want to put our hand up and say, I'm lonely, I want a partner, I don't know what to do. And there were indeed people who went online and believed they were in a relationship with an implausible hunk, an image of, or a gorgeous looking, very attractive woman. Certainly one person lost her home because she had mortgaged it to over 300, and her savings of over £300,000, and was disbelieving when the police finally called and told her that this person was not actually a person. She'd been engaging with a website somewhere in Nigeria. There are many such cases. There is a woman currently working to unravel the fact of predatory marriage. So there is potential for us not just to invest and put our shoulders behind the anti-scamming stuff, but to remain good friends with people. It's often observed that people, if only they had a good friend to say, come on, love, come on, this just doesn't seem right, it doesn't feel right. Particularly as he's asked for another 20k. When are you going to meet? And those are the awful realities of some people's lives, that actually they don't have those good friends and those good pals. And professionals, we can stand in sometimes, but actually that relationship is very, very important. So, is that an area that we'll be looking at? I don't know. The forum is made up of professionals. I don't even know who they all are at the moment. But lots of professionals, regional groups, and individuals who can raise awareness. I'm not interested in just raising awareness, though. I want to find a way of demonstrating that we have made progress. I'm struck that so very many reviews in England and in Wales recommend we need to raise awareness of the Mental Capacity Act. I think minimally what we can do is say, where exactly did the Mental Capacity Act, when should it have been invoked? Why wasn't it invoked? And what are we going to do about it? That would be more helpful than saying we need to raise awareness. And I think we'd find if we did that sort of exercise, we'd actually have something that's really valuable that we can work on. And I say we, not in a royal sense, but rather in the sense that there is no money in this. You know, it's us, it's the population. We are attorneys. You know, we're not paid to do this. This is something that we do on behalf of our relatives. Necessarily, if we get greedy or times are hard and we start dipping into our relatives' funds, for example, necessarily we'll be challenged, but only if that becomes noticeable and visible. So a lot hinges on trust and the goodwill, our goodwill. I'm interested particularly in transitions and why we are so poor, even after many years of research, at attending to young people at 16, 17 plus. I was involved in research donkeys ago looking at transitions, and families then were saying it's a cliff edge. And here we are, all these years later, it's still a cliff edge. But I think perhaps with the assistance of children's services, schools, and the children's commissioners, we can make some progress here. We should start thinking about decision-making very young people. And the curriculum in Wales is really quite innovative, and I think it's going to happen. I don't know enough about the curriculum in England, but we have to start thinking about encouraging children to make decisions and not expecting them to be able to make decisions without any experience once they hit 16 and 17. There's some lovely work, and I've also been asked to give you some examples. There's some lovely work by Rosie Barnes. She's a professor at Birmingham University, and if you look at her website, I think there's a website called Clarity. She has looked at the decision-making of staff working in particular services, and they're doing some fabulous stuff. And she said, what we have to do is to upscale that fabulous stuff and use those skills as we think about the more challenging decisions. The interface with the Mental Health Act is really quite problematic. That's all I'm going to say. If you've got any help on this front, that would be great. But there is work to be done on this, and I think it's really, really hard for practitioners and for families that the code of practice the draft code of practice is over 500 pages long. Now, I'd like to think that you'd respond to it and respond to the consultation, but frankly, who's going to carry around 500 pages and flick through when they've got a complicated task ahead of them in terms of assisting somebody to make a decision? We've lost the plot somehow, and we have to return, and we have to return to good common sense. I think, too, there's a great deal of training around mental capacity. I think at any one time there's probably hundreds of people crisscrossing England and Wales with flip charts, reminding everybody of the principles. And there aren't many of us who would challenge those principles. But what we want to know is almost the colour the numbers. You know, we want something really very specific. And yet life is so complicated, you know, we can't possibly do anything more specific, which is probably why we've got guidance that's 500 and something pages. And maybe if we are to revise this legislation, it'll get even longer. So we're not going to get answers to very specific questions, but together it becomes possible to explore different outcomes for individuals. We heard earlier of the importance of working together, of working with our colleagues and thinking things through. I know that feels like a luxury in incredibly busy times and when resources are very thin, but actually that task of thinking things through is incredibly important. It does matter, no matter what level we are in services, that scope to be able to talk to other people and say, what do you think about this? This is where I've got to. And also to track that, just to make a note, discussed with, this is the outcome, this is what we're doing because of this. We heard about evidence gathering this morning. It is so important. And it does seem really quite hard that services are punished in reviews because they are so poor at keeping track of this valuable information. I don't think we've exhausted our ingenuity yet. I think there's a lot that remains to be done when you think about the challenges of even online banking, and you think about the digitally excluded. What on earth are we going to do to help them? I think it's even this week, we've heard about older people who are unable to download apps because they don't have they don't have phones, so that they can park their cars in GP surgeries. So our world is changing very fast, and yet we are not yet taking account of people who are struggling and people who are living in abject poverty. And there are things, these are matters that certainly the forum is attuned to, but we can't resolve all of this. It does seem astonishing, doesn't it, that the bailout of the banks, and just to be political, as Anthony was a little earlier, the bailout of the banks in 2008 did not result in a better banking service. If anything, it resulted in the removal of banks from our high streets. And so people now are expected to travel far and wide if they want to go into a bank. When I moved to Wales, I went into a bank and said, I'm really interested to know how you support people who struggle to understand banking. I'm interested in it anyway, not least because of my brother. And they said, you need to meet Jean. She's a Rottweiler. And only last week, a very elderly customer came in wanting to take out £4,000 for work that was being done on her house. And Jean said, I'm sorry, Mrs. So-and-so, you can't have it because it's taken you a long time to save this money, and I don't know the man who's standing next to you. She had no authority to do that, by the way, but she knew this woman, and she knew that she was about to be scammed. And that personal contact is so very, very important. That continuity is important. Needless to say, that bank has gone now. And so that wonderful woman, I hope she's elsewhere supporting people and being a Rottweiler on behalf of vulnerable customers. But I don't know. I really don't know. So what have I gathered from my work to date? I've gathered that in terms of communication, there's lots yet to do. It seems astonishing to me that we can spend a great deal of time assessing people, and yet we know so little about them. I've given you the glimpse of the hospital records and the parents' view, and yet in not having that personal story, we lose so much. I met a couple just a few weeks ago whose daughter's life is anchored in desperate mental health problems, and their reputation went before them because they are so angry, and yet when they talked about their experiences, their anger appeared perfectly justified because they had information that they wanted to share, just as the families at Winterbourne View had wanted to share information with the staff who were not interested. So one parent said at Winterbourne View, we gave them our most precious person, and that's what they did. And she said, I explained, if you approach my daughter from the right-hand side, we can't explain it, she will thump you. So please always, always approach from the left. It's pretty sound advice. She wrote it down, she told them, she said it in meetings, in review meetings. Then she was informed that actually because her daughter had assaulted a member of staff, she was going to have to be moved to a more secure part of the service. And that staff had been assaulted because she'd approached from the wrong side. You will know of many cases like this where families write things down, tell staff, and yet there isn't time almost to absorb what that means and what the implications are for looking out for that person in the very best of senses. It was probably a few years ago that I was asked to assist I was at the Royal College of General Practitioners. I was a fellow, and I worked with a group of people with learning disabilities to share with the great and the good of the Royal College what the experience of people with learning disabilities was in terms of healthcare, physical healthcare. And we were to meet, this group and I were to meet the Prince of Wales. So very big deal if you're a royalist. If you're not, it's indifferent, I know. But there was extreme concern that, you know, what are you going to do? Can we have a script? Can we have a copy of your script? I said no, because the two people who very much wanted to communicate what the experience of being a patient was like did not read. So that was a challenge. So no, there's no script, but we have prepared this. And what we're going to do is to show the Prince of Wales and the great and the good in general practice what the experience is like. So Anya and her partner, Paul, decided that Anya, who has Down syndrome, Anya would be a doctor, and I would be a new mother, and Paul would be my partner. And Anya swept into the room with a plastic stethoscope round her neck, and I was cradling an invisible baby. Paul had his arm round me, and Anya said, "You've got a Mongol. Do you know what that means?" And it was very shocking. It was profoundly shocking, even more so because Anya has Down syndrome. And she said, "Anyway, put her in a home, forget about her, have another baby." And swanned off, and there was a sharp intake of breath because it was more abrupt than we had rehearsed, and I'd hoped it would be a little bit longer. But in fact, then I said, there's another part to this. And Anya came back in, and she said, "You've got a beautiful baby. What are you going to call her? Can I hold her? Can I see what she's like? She's beautiful. She'll probably do many things, and you will get a lot of joy from her," or words to that effect. And it was profoundly powerful as a way of communicating. And I think it's those sorts of stories that I very much hope we will be able to draw from when we think about mental capacity. We will never be able to cover the whole range of topics that exercises on an almost daily basis. But we can draw down particular themes and say, these are some very, very real examples of what it is that it's possible to do. And these are some of the processes that take us there. And that's my best hope. I don't want people to be overwhelmed with case law. There is case law, and there are some fantastic people who are making sense of that for us. And I include myself in that. Some of the case law is unbelievably dense. But I don't want us to be terrified of it. I want us to think about how this works in our day-to-day lives. So we have got people like Wayne Martin, whose website, The Autonomy Project, Essex University. I don't know whether you've come across that, but just have a look at some of these. They are really helpful in terms of thinking about autonomy in our day-to-day lives. So you've got Rosie Harding at Birmingham and Wayne Martin. The other blogger, another blogger, is Lucy Series. I don't know whether you've come across her website. She writes, her website is called The Small Places, and it's a quotation from Eleanor Roosevelt, who talks about how our rights are played out in the small places of our own homes, for example. So Lucy Series, S-E-R-I-E-S. I made another couple of notes that I thought might be helpful for you as well. There are, let's see, the Autonomy Project. And Alex Ruck-Keene, of course. I don't know whether you've come across his website. He writes about mental capacity in the law. He is probably the foremost barrister in the country, and he makes sense of some of the most complicated cases. And I would strongly recommend that you follow Alex's website and his blog. And I think I'd also recommend that you talk to your local authority solicitors. I don't mean in terms of involving them in every possible scenario, but I'm very conscious that certainly in North Wales there are a group of solicitors who work together to address all sorts of upcoming problems, but also to think about how we can make the world somewhat easier, not just for professionals, but also for ourselves in different areas of our lives. And I'm struck that they were very interested that it was an estate agent who approached them, one of them, and said, there's an elderly person just come into the office who is selling their home, and I'm not sure about it because they didn't seem to understand the process. They seemed to think they would be returning home once it had been sold, and the people who were with them, with this person, were a bit too slick. So as a result of that, they developed work with other estate agents, thinking about the people who are approaching them and coming into the offices. And it's that opportunism that I find really very exciting in the work that we do, which is how do we find out about this? And there are always people who are willing to discuss, explore, and the generosity of these people is really quite phenomenal. Some of the best opportunities are actually not that far away. Corston Park is just over the border. And as a result of the work at Corston Park Hospital, the Safeguarding Board there have started a programme of work that is about placing adults with learning disabilities and about establishing and ensuring that there is connection with those adults, not least of all from the local authority. They've also started some work around mental capacity. It's only over the border. Why don't you join them? They've done a very quick, Walter Lloyd-Smith would say, a very quick survey, but they're getting some interesting information. They want a series of workshops. Why not participate? That could be really valuable, not just for your own learning here, but also for the bigger picture, because this legislation, as with most legislation, plays out at the personal level as well as the big picture level. And that will help us identify some of the levers that are really very important. I don't think we've exhausted ingenuity. I think there's a lot yet to be done. And I think there are some fabulous emerging programmes of work. My task is to pull some of those together, to engage with yourselves, either individually and regionally and through professional groups. But I hope that you will assist me in making this legislation work to all of our benefits, because we're all potential subjects. So I'll leave it there and answer any questions, as long as they're not too difficult. Thank you. Is that all right?
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
So there are roving mics. Thanks very much, Margaret. That was brilliant. We'll sign up to the work with Norfolk, as you suggest, and we've got time for 4 or 5 questions. Or points.
Stunned silence, maybe?
Oh, it always takes 10 seconds, don't worry. Just pause.
Can I just ask?
We'll bring the mic to you.
Thanks.
I was just wanting to know the name of the person that you recommended a website, and I only got his first name.
This Alex Ruck-Keene is the barrister. 39 chambers. They also produce a newsletter you can sign up to, and The other one is Wayne Martin at Essex University.
We'll be sending a follow-up email after the conference, so I'll include a link as well in that.
Thank you.
Just to say as well, there's a really helpful resource on Norfolk's Safeguarding Adults Board website, which is called Tricky Friends. So if you're working with people with learning difficulties or autism, it kind of touches on what Margaret mentioned earlier around Stephen Hoskin's case. It's really helpful. It's completely animated, and it takes people through, you know, exploring if their friendships might be potentially dangerous or a bit disingenuous. So that's a really good resource if anyone wants it. I'm coming.
Thank you. I don't know if this is a question or just my thoughts, really, so sort of bear with me. I'm interested in the ideas of executive choices and executive capacity and executive functioning. And we heard earlier, didn't we, about the professional curiosity and collecting information from a variety of sources. My understanding of executive functioning is about, as long as you present the information and test it and challenge it through things like repertory grids and finding information through a variety of sources and presenting it in different ways, then actually you get to the nub of the truth, and you get beyond the veneer, and you take away the barriers for the person. You know, it seems to me like we're stuck in decisional capacity, and we're locking people's lives down. So is there any advice you can give to us about how to unlock those lives and unlock those decisions and really get to the nub of neutralising, I guess, or getting to that executive functioning, understanding the person's life, I guess, really, and giving them choices? Was that a question, or was it just a rambling? I don't know.
It's a combination. I think it is truly about immersing yourself in what is known about the person. That's the stuff that's written, but also the stuff that you learn from the family. If I return to Horston Park and think of Joanna, it was said, decided she didn't want to use her CPAP machine. That is such an important decision. And it turned out to be a highly critical decision because she required that machine every night. Her parents had no idea that she'd even been offered the option to decline the machine, because when she was at home, it was something that they routinely attended to each evening. They knew if she needed to go to the loo at night, they knew to just go into the bedroom and make sure that the machine was back functioning and she was comfortable, because it covers the nose and mouth, and it makes a noise. So that was just something that they did all the time. They shared that valuable information with the hospital, and yet somehow Joanna was seen as the capacitor's decision maker when the family were appalled that the question had even been posed. So it wouldn't have made much difference the first couple of nights that she was not using it, but over time it would have made one heck of a difference. And I think the point is that you stay with something. So we've tried it out. Go back to the family, talk to them. This is what we've done, 2 nights. They would probably say, absolutely not, because this has happened before. Look to history as well. Her history was that it had not been an issue in any of the previous services that Joanna had lived in. She had used this machine, and it was uncontentious. She just did it, and staff assisted her. But at Horston Park, the approach was somewhat different. So stay with the topic, and don't forget show and tell, but also look back over history. Histories do authorise futures, and sometimes we want them to authorise a future, and we certainly would have wanted that future to be authorised, the use of her CPAP every night, but it didn't happen. Show and tell.
I don't know whether it's just by what you were saying. Do you think we've gone from one extreme to the other of maybe being fearful that we're not allowing people to make decisions, so now we're not actually testing that and letting people demonstrate it, and that's where Joanna obviously didn't, because they all know she can make that decision.
Yes, I think it's the weighing, isn't it, of empowerment and protection, and it's really as with what used to make me furious as a sister. You know, it's his choice not to shower. It's his choice not to shave. It's his choice if he doesn't want to attend to his personal hygiene at all, and it just made me furious because the consequences of that choice weren't well considered. So when he came to stay with me, you know, almost the first thing I did, you know, and I was very tempted to hose him down outside without even letting him into the house. The very first thing I did was, you know, make a bath attractive. Did he resist going in? Of course he didn't. You know, there's the candle on the side of the bath, and the smellies are in the bath, and let's have a glass of wine when you come down. You know, there are ways of doing these things, and yet it does take time to discover which of those ways will work. But that tension, I think, you know, the fact that we're aware of it and you're aware of it means that, you know, let's document what it is that we're doing. And I don't mean an essay. This is why I'm doing this.
Two more, then coffee. I'll just ask one, Margaret, which is just, let's say we sign up, as we will, from Suffolk to your work. What form would you like that to take to support the national work?
I think where you have got worked examples of decision support, people who would be described as complicated or tricky, and you have worked hard to make that work, and you have sought to adhere closely to the legislation, and you're very upfront about where the stumbling blocks were and where you thought it was falling on its face and how you recovered it. Those kind of examples are really valuable for all of us, because we remember the stories, we do remember them. And there will be stories about people with mental health challenges, brain injuries, and I don't particularly want to chunk them, but maybe we will have to do so. I do recall, for example, work in Somerset where a man with an acquired brain injury was assumed to have capacity to make a range of decisions that were absolutely not within his gift. And his life must have been bleak in the extreme before he decided to take it.
So I have just one question, actually. So in my role within the partnership, we often hear conversations between professionals around when you're working with people around capacity, it's often down to professional judgment. And I know some of that has been touched on, but it's kind of like you have one person working with a case, and then they'll hand over to somebody else who would then say, oh, I wouldn't have done it this way, or I don't think it should be done like that, or they've just got completely different opinions. And I think what we see in practice is that's okay. It's, you know, judgment is always different, but I think what we see is people feeling unsafe in knowing that their judgment and their call is okay, even if it's different to what somebody else's might be. So what would you kind of advise in that scenario?
I think, you're right, it's absolutely legitimate, and the task for each of us is to remain in respectful engagement. I think at Corston Park and also at Winterbourne View, there was unbelievable deference to the psychiatrists. And I'm not suggesting we should start being rude to psychiatrists, but we should be able to say, please explain your position, because this is my position and this is where I'm coming from. And this is how I'm using the legislation. And please explain, because you know, we've got to deliver something good for this person that is competent and compliant with the law.